Welcome to the Revenue Above Replacement podcast. I am Adam Grossman. With me today is Jason Sinnarajah. Jason, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me, Adam. Appreciate it.
Yeah, well, looking forward to the conversation. We start this conversation the way we start every conversation, which is walk us through your career to date and tell us how you got to your current position.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me again, and I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
I went to Darden, so sorry to the Northwestern crew. I really respect your school a lot, but I went to Boston College undergrad, and I went to Darden for my MBA in '07, and then I ended up taking a job at Google. So I thought about going into the financial markets. I got an offer to go to a buy-side firm, but I decided to go down the Google path. And so I joined Google in '07 in a group that was focused around Latin America and Asia. We were like internal consultants helping set up businesses. And if you think about where Google was at that time, we just bought YouTube and we were a much smaller company at the time. So I got exposed to a lot of cool things. We launched YouTube in Mexico and Brazil. We did some of the first sort of monetization of YouTube back then in those markets, which was a lot of fun. And YouTube obviously was not what it is today, and
Sure.
it's much smaller back then. Along the way, we worked on a project that was looking at our Asia headquarters moving from Mountain View, California to Singapore. I was a part of that. And then eventually I moved out to Singapore, which was a lot of fun. I spent almost a year there setting up our international business out there in our APAC headquarters. So got to do the go-to-market strategy for all these little markets in Southeast Asia, which aren't really little, but at the time, the internet back then was like, a few sites were written in Thai and a few sites were in Malay. Most everything that they were consuming was in English. So it was really cool to be a part of that to, expand the internet really in those markets and encourage agencies and content creators to put out things in local language. From there, they moved me to Sydney, which was an awesome personal dream of mine to live in Australia for a year. That was a little bit more of a mature market. They obviously spoke English, which was nice. And I got to cover Australia and New Zealand. We bought a company called DoubleClick, which is the huge ad tech business. So I integrated that across Asia, which was a lot of fun and got to learn the ins and outs of the buy side, sell side on the ad tech world, which is huge today. And I also helped set up our tax entity in Singapore, where we routed all of our revenue through Singapore as opposed to Ireland, which was the way we had previously done it. After about a year, they moved me to Tokyo, which was also a really great experience. And I learned Japanese, got to work in the Tokyo market. We bought the local DoubleClick Japan. And then I got kind of full circle, brought me back to YouTube. We launched the sort of what I would call the modern day version of YouTube. And what I mean by that is we started working with K-pop and J-pop stars, things that you see now today. We did some of the first sort of cross marketing where we had Samsung be a part of a K-pop deal on YouTube and do concerts on YouTube and do promotion of music videos, things like that. One of the first streaming deals ever in sports actually was the Indian Premier League, where we streamed that to non-North American viewers. So most people probably on this podcast didn't see that, but it was the first foray into sports streaming, and that was a lot of fun for me. And then after a little time there, I moved back to the States and I ran search content partnerships. So what does that mean? If you type in Northwestern Athletics, Chicago Bears, Kansas City Royals, you get a little box of information on the top and on the side, and I helped build that product out. And we started embedding YouTube videos, content. We put in logos. We made the product more enriching, and it's kind of what is what you see on mobile today. And I'm really proud of that because that brought the sports leagues into sort of the Google search ecosystem. It was my first foray into doing business development and partnership deals that had revenue impacts and so forth. And obviously, Google was a huge player even back then, which was a lot of fun. After that, I left Google after almost 5.5 years. I met a Northwestern alum, Andrew Miller, who recruited me to the Cleveland Indians. And Andrew's become a mentor of mine. He's a JD MBA, so shout out to Kellogg. But he recruited me to be a part of a strategy and analytics crew at the Cleveland Indians, as they were known at the time, now the Cleveland Guardians, obviously. And for almost 3 years there, I was a part of a small team, effectively helping run the franchise, right? We looked at our headcount, we looked at different leadership roles, we made some adjustments. We brought in a chief revenue officer, for instance, Brian Barron, who's now the president of the team. We looked at the way we sold tickets. So I actually ran ticket sales for a couple of renewal cycles. I did all the compensation and the KPI goals for ticket sales, sponsorship. partnership sales, group sales, and it was really effectively running the ticket sales for a little while there too, in terms of how to structure it, use CRM, all the nitty-gritty things that they don't teach you at business school, but those are the most important things to revenue monetization, especially in sports, right? Who to reach out to customers, how do you tier them, et cetera. We moved our team from paper tickets to digital tickets to fully digital, as I like to call it. So it used to be, you had the paper ticket, and then it went to, okay, we're going to have digital tickets, but people would just bring pieces of paper that they had printed out. And now we went to digital tickets while we were there. When we moved to tickets.com, which is an MLB entity, which was a lot of fun. I did our food and beverage deal. So, I think Northwestern has a real close tie to Levy. We looked at Levy, we looked at Aramark, but we ended up staying with the incumbent Delaware North, which was, a massive deal for a franchise. A lot of people don't think about food and beverage in particular being a large revenue source for a team, but they really are. I mean, especially in today's world, they're usually the second or third largest revenue source at a local level for a sports team. So that was a lot of fun. And then I even got involved with a little bit of the baseball side very briefly with, looking at arbitration, looking at, free agency and helping negotiate, or helping our scouts negotiate different things when we had draft potential and so forth. So that was a lot of fun. But after that, we had a family situation, so we had to move back to San Francisco. So I actually moved back into my old media route, and I moved to the Weather Channel. So I was doing business strategy and development there at a global level for the Weather Channel property. So the Weather Channel at the time was owned by Blaine and Blackstone. We ended up selling to IBM, and then it got bought by IBM, but then we moved the digital side to that entity. And that was a lot of fun. I went with that. We did deals around the world. I remember going to Brazil and Argentina and Mexico. I did deal with Rogers to expand the weather company's reach. So if you think about the app is one of the most downloaded app in the world. And the property of the weather.com and Weather Channel had actually a couple 100 million active unique visitors. And so we were trying to get to 1 billion, which is an ambitious goal. But we did deals with Facebook Live. I remember negotiating one of the first Facebook Live deals ever to put our content onto Facebook. We negotiated deals with Snap. We put the weather on Google in more prominent fashion. We had the weather on Apple. If you remember the weather icon on your iPhone that's there, it used to be powered by the Weather Channel. And we got it into Facebook, which was not a trivial task back then, which was a lot of fun. And so after that, my boss actually recruited me to a company called Ziff Davis. And Ziff Davis is, for those of you that don't know, is an internet holding company, publicly traded, but acts a little bit like private equity in the sense we bought companies for growth, which was a lot of fun. So I worked on our Ziff Media Group, which owned brands like Mashable.com, PCMag.com, Ask Men, and then expanded my duties to sort of cover all of the Ziff Davis ecosystem, which included IGN, which is the gaming side, some of the entities around more tech that we were looking at, and looking at things like Humble Bundle, Ookla, which is the speed test app, et cetera. And that was a lot of fun because I got to buy companies or look at buying companies, looked at about 80 transactions. We bought 4, which was fun, and then had to kind of jointly run them as well, which was also something that was cool. But I don't recommend buying companies and operating at the same time. I got a call in early 2020, from the owners of the Buffalo Bills, from Kim Pegula, which was a great honor. And that's how I ended up moving from San Francisco back into sports and moved to the Buffalo Bills. And I'm originally from Toronto, so that was a huge thrill. The Bills were my team, and my parents happened to live in Buffalo. So it all worked out. But then COVID hit. And so it kind of was on pause for a few months and then re-engaged. And I moved out to Buffalo in July of 2020. And my first sort of task that was given was the 2020 COVID rules, which was like a 7-page document, I think, from the NFL about how to operate during that. But my roles there were I was running the business side. So, all the monetization, all the revenue stuff, ticket sales, marketing, community relations, stadium ops, being the security, et cetera. And that was a real fun job because I reported directly to our owner. And we were a team that was in a smaller market in the NFL, but we had a lot of opportunities, right? Josh Allen was, I think, just finishing his second year when I got there. So I was there for his third year, and he was ascending to be what he is now, which is a superstar. But the Bills were also ascending on the off the field stuff. Our brand was growing. We got to do a lot of cool things with the growing brand. So we took our app from 0 to almost 400,000 registered app users. Again, my app background was helpful there. Our monetization, we were able to increase our revenue by about 50%. through a variety of things that we did on pricing and analytics and obviously selling more and marketing more of the team. And then we helped build a new stadium, which was a lot of fun too, and get the deal done with the state of New York and Erie County, which was a really cool thing. And then lastly, I left that in 2023 and got recruited here to the Royals, which I'm now the chief operating officer. And here I oversee our stadium operations, more of the operational side, our food and beverage and retail business, our analytics, technology business and strategy, and then our ticket operations, which covers single game tickets and help out with overall ticket sales. So it's been a fun journey. I really love sports. I have a unique blend of sports, media, and tech throughout my career, but I draw from those experiences to help me do the best I can to help the Royals monetize as effective as they can and be as successful as we can be.
I think actually that last point is where I wanted to start the kind of the questions that I had, which is, as you mentioned, you have a media, tech, search, you have a lot of background outside of sports that's helped you within sports. So can you talk a little bit more about that in terms of how you've leveraged, I mean, you talked about it a little bit already, but how you leverage your background outside of sports to achieve success within the sports field and sports industry?
Yeah, a lot of days, Adam, I mean, it's weird, right? Like I have this whole career that I was a senior executive in so the media tech world, spending a lot of time in New York, San Francisco. I was commuting between the two. And I have to kind of shut that part of my brain down because it's not relevant here. And a lot of people in sports actually don't even know about all that stuff. And I'm not a self-promoting guy, so I don't talk about it. But there are days when I do draw from it. For instance, right, I mentioned we bought DoubleClick at Google.
Yeah.
And I had worked in the financial markets. I did my summer internship at UBS in trading, right? And you think about the buy and the sell side. Well, some of that's analogous to ticketing pricing, right? Like there's a whole algorithmic model or set of models that is going on today with how you monetize ticketing at a primary and secondary level. And because I have that knowledge of how those markets work and how transactions work and how algos work and the product side, that's helped me be better at sort of thinking through and helping our teams here at the Royals and even at the Bills in terms of how to price better, how to think about yield maximization and monetization and drive the biggest economies of scale because I've run companies that were really lean that had to use limited resources to maximize EBITDA. We were running businesses at Ziff Davis that were 41% EBITDA margins, right? So I'm used to thinking that way. And so I think about how do I grow revenue with as least amount of expense growth as possible. Right. That's a little bit different, but that's that background that comes out. I don't explicitly say it that way, obviously, but that's kind of how I think.
Yeah, I mean, you've used a lot of terms already, whether it's EBITDA, buy side, sell side, yield maximization. The reason I bring it up is that obviously one of the big topics that's happening in the sports industry is the growth of private equity, the financialization of sports. You talk about that, from your perspective, just even both from working on the team side, but obviously your previous background, and you're seeing, like you're talking about, we're talking EBITDA margins and optimization. Those are terms, you're typically associated with private equity or financial, capital.
Yeah, I mean, when I was at Ziff Davis, that's all I thought about. So when I went to Hills, I was, and even the Sabres, which we owned as well, I would think about that. But the reality is, right, like obviously you have to worry about the financials and the bottom line and so forth. And savvy investors, like we've seen in private equity, worry about that. But there is an element that, at least in baseball in particular, right? This is my second go around of baseball. The way I view it is the more cash you can bring in, the more financials and better sort of operator we are, really can be funneled back into team success and hopefully payroll and things like that. That's how I view it. Again, obviously that's an ownership discussion and, every owner handles it differently. But for me and how I motivate our teams, I think about, okay, if we do the best job we can, we get more people in here that hopefully can be helping us win, right? And that's how I look at it. I think the private equity model, it's been interesting, right? Bills and a lot of other teams in the NFL have taken money. There's these great firms, Arctos and Aries and Sixth Street that are now involved in this. And I think there's going to be more and more of that just because sports is a great asset class and sports is always going to be an asset class that's A, interesting, but B, actually has some pretty cool financial elements and opportunities there. And then three, I think these assets, especially with the national revenues going up and the media side and so forth, there's some attractiveness there, right? So, I think these are really cool assets. They're also limited. and there's some intrinsic value around that. But I really, for me personally, I think it's really cool because you see all these folks that are coming in now that are thinking about sports differently as an asset class, and that's personally interesting for me.
Yeah, I mean, you talk this about more holistically than any specific example, but sports as an asset class, given that you've been on both buy side and sell side transactions, right? You've been the buyer, you mentioned, of businesses, you were part of that company that got acquired. Can you talk about, like, just in general, when you say sports is an attractive asset class, like what does that mean and how does it compare to some of the other companies outside of sports that you worked with?
Yeah, I mean, like, so just from a purely financial perspective, the when we used to buy companies at Ziff, we had very, very, very tight and focused financial metrics, right? Percentage of EBITDA, for instance, et cetera. In sports, right, it's a little bit different. A lot of teams typically will trade on, revenue and all those kinds of multiples, right? So there's a little bit of difference there. And the traditional metrics that you see in business don't sometimes apply to sports because A, these are private enterprises, and B, at the end of the day, there's a value, right, associated with owning a team and team success and things that are maybe out of the control of people like myself. So I think that's really, really intriguing. I'm sure there's a whole host of, well, I know that there's a whole host of tax and other financial things that are well beyond my understanding of this, but there's elements there that are really intriguing as well. And then look, I mean, I've never been in a position where I've had that type of wealth and so forth, but there's some intrigue right around owning an asset. You see this in Europe, you see this here. I think you'll see it around the world, where they're unique assets, right? I think Steve Cohen has said that they're like art or whatever. I mean, I don't fully understand that analogy, but there's some unique elements to owning these assets that create some opportunities financially.
Yeah, and talking about unique elements in the sports business, just going back to when you first were recruited by the Cleveland Guardian or then Indians, now Guardians, like what was attractive? You mentioned like you work in sports, you obviously have had
Yeah.
now several leadership roles in sports. What was interesting? And you were at Google, you did a lot, you're traveling the world, and I want to get back to that part of it also. But what was interesting to you about sports and working in the business in sports from from the jump or from the start when you first got the role
Yeah.
in Cleveland?
Well, it wasn't the money, Adam. That's probably the biggest thing. I remember, I mean, I think I took like a 90% pay cut, like nines. And so you got to really want it. But I was really blessed that I'd had the career at Google. I was fairly young when I graduated Darden. So, I had some opportunities that way. And most importantly, I met my wife at Darden who has allowed me to go on this journey as well. And she's an active partner. So I'm very grateful for that. So I should give her a shout out too as part of this. But I think, what was attractive was a couple of things. I mean, one, I was really intrigued by sports, right? I knew that was an interesting thing to me. It was something that got me going. It was a business. I was interested in the business side too. And I think that's an important distinction. I was interested in the baseball side. I'd played a little baseball, in my past. And so I really loved the game, but I wasn't trying to be Theo Epstein at the time or some of these folks that are now GMs and president of baseball ops. I was more interested in the business side. I like the unit economics. I like talking about ticket sales or suite sales or sponsorship or media rights or what have you, or real estate. And I saw the opportunity of sports as kind of two things, right? This is like in 2012, 2013, like there were two things. There were media assets, right? Because of their eyeballs, and the real estate opportunities because you brought a lot of people in. And so for me, that was really intriguing. But really, at the end of the day, if I'm being honest, like the team in Cleveland, I mean, Andrew and Mark Shapiro was his boss and our sort of larger mentor. They had built this team of folks. Jeff Weiland is a Northwestern grad. We hired a few, well, actually, we hired a lot of Northwestern grads, but we just had just a really cool team there of people that I knew I could learn from, that I really enjoyed, that were super smart. And most importantly, we would see a holistic side of the business. So I had one of those unique roles that I got to see baseball and the business side come together and be a part of any major decisions at that. So for me, the money was kind of a secondary thing, clearly. The bigger thing was building up a career and learning how to run a business, right? And this happened to be a sports business, which I loved, and that was intriguing.
Yeah, and the two things that came from that discussion, from what you just mentioned, that we want to talk about. But first, about building a business and learning to build a business in the
Yeah.
business of sports. What what was that like to learn about the business? You mentioned like learning about CRM and some of the things you didn't learn in business school, but two, one of the through lines that does come through, and one of the things that obviously we like to talk about is data analytics, Virginia data and analytics. So how do those kind of combine as you were learning to run the business in Cleveland?
Yeah. So ironically, at Google, actually, I'd worked on CRM. We tried to build our own
Oh,
version of that. Uh, and we had looked at, buying companies in that space, but I'd worked at CRM. So I kind of saw that. And we had our first tool, it's called GRM, Google Related Information. And I worked a lot with salespeople there. And so again, this is where these like really weird analogies I can draw that I could draw, but nobody would ever understand. I was working with salespeople all around the world at Google about, documenting, the interactions and the conversations and figuring out, okay, how do we optimize that? And how do we do yield management? And how do we think about this customer in this way? And how do we sell our value proposition? I would go on sales calls. So I learned that. Like I remember going in Australia and even in Japan, I learned to speak a little Japanese and we went around and did that. And so when I shifted to Google back in the States and I was running search, it was partnership, right? Thinking about what leagues cared about and how they wanted to go there. So the two of those experiences actually kind of helped me when I was at the Indians, even though that was a totally different working 100-plus-year-old franchise with people that have been there for a long time that kind of needed only the Indians. And we were looking at, okay, how do we take a small market franchise and how do we optimize it? How do we, increase ticket sales, right? How do we follow up on leads? How do we think about client engagement? All of things kind of melded it together into our CRM, which was built on dynamics and thinking about, okay, how do we understand these touch points? How do we incentivize our teams to meet the fan where they are, in this case, the stadium? How do we bring up ticket sales and renewals from traditionally in the off season to maybe in season? So you had that natural touch point. So we moved our renewal schedule up from what had traditionally been in October into the season in August and then even into late July. And that was a more effective way of connecting with the fans because they were already engaged. You could present the value proposition of next year's pricing and next year's product. And we measured that. And so when we measured that, we started creating data and analytics. We had a great analyst, David Shin, also a Northwestern grad, common theme here. And he put it all into Tableau. And we were studying that. We could see that and then disseminate that information across the organization to make the best decisions. So, all these experiences kind of helped me early on to be able to look at that. And then all those things helped us figure out, okay, best pricing, optimal product strategy. How do you do new product development in terms of the stadium and so forth? It helped me think about food and beverage. We were actually one of the first teams that did value pricing. We did a 4-3-2-1 concept. We had $1 dogs, $2 refills, $3 hot dogs every game, and $4 beers. And we put that out there. And I remember talking to our concessionaire about it. And, obviously that's a concern for them because they're looking at, okay, if you're bringing that price, then my yield and my unit economics are challenged. And we said, no, the unit volume will go up. And we had unit volumes go up 250+%. And it kind of negated that conversation. We were so successful at it that I know the Atlanta teams, took that and they really marketed that and they get a lot of credit for that. So I always give them a hard time, but that's sports, right? And so I think just understanding the numbers, understanding the business, and then making decisions out of that was really one of the greatest things I learned out of that Cleveland experience. And I was really encouraged by the folks that were there from a management perspective.
And then making decisions. That's one of the things we also
Yeah.
like to talk about is how do you use numbers, like particularly to communicate those insights from the data to people who don't have quantitative backgrounds or strong quantitative backgrounds. You mentioned building Tableau and or building an instance in Tableau, but how do you think about translating quantitative insights and data analysis so it can permeate throughout the organization?
Yeah. I mean, ironically, that's also something that I had to work on at Google, which you think of as a quantitative phase. But again, working with salespeople, right? You want really good salespeople who have a mix of quantitative and qualitative, right? But gravitate toward that relationship and all that kind of good stuff, right? And I again, I had done that too. I'd done business development. So just thinking about how to present it and present facts was something I also learned at Google, right? Because I used to go in the query logs and understand, all the different things and different trends. And I mean, you could see everything, right, in that world. But being able to present a story around that to go to a Stats Inc. or a partner at the league level and say, here's the story around this, was something I started cultivating there. And I think in Cleveland, I certainly got a lot better at it because you have to explain it and you have to make it easy to understand. And you also have to make people who aren't in the data feel more comfortable with it. And so that it's their idea, right? And that takes a while. And that's something I've continually tried to evolve onto, but it's a hard thing as well.
Yeah, and the other point I wanted to get back to, which you brought up in your time with Cleveland that permeated your time with Buffalo, is the real estate element. So can you talk about, real estate as we've talked about previously on this podcast and I've written about and focused on a little bit of my current company. But can you talk about it even then when you talk about you saw it as a media and real estate company? What was it like to think of the Indians and then later Buffalo
Yeah.
kind of real estate entities?
Yeah. So like, just to be clear, we never actually pursued any real
Right.
estate, but one of the things from a trend perspective, you could tell, right, is, and again, this is where the data kind of comes in, is like, there are not too many businesses around the world that are drawing, X amount of people. So let's just say 2 million people, right? Like a baseball team does, or, 1 million people like an arena does, or almost, I think it was like 700,000 people like a football team does. When you have those opportunities that are so captivating with sports teams that people are coming to your venue, there's a lot of other opportunities around there. So I'm not surprised over the last 10 plus years that districts have developed and things like that have occurred, because you're bringing people in to something that's really captivating and you have an opportunity to do stuff around there. So we looked at that, I know for the Buffalo Stadium, I mean, the key thing was to get the stadium up, which is what's happening. But we also, own the hockey rink there, and there's they'd already started doing some stuff around that. And it's there's a lot of opportunities to engage a captivated audience. So that's what I meant by, seeing that 10 plus years ago.
Yeah, and with Buffalo, I mean, I guess you mentioned that might have been part of the reason to get involved with Buffalo from your perspective when, Kim Bakula called you. One, I guess that's interesting that she called it. That's obviously a very cool experience. But two, how did you think about the real estate element and potentially the building of a new stadium? And also you mentioned being from Toronto and being able to tap in more into the Toronto kind of DMA from the Buffalo side. How did that all factor into your decision to go with the Bills?
Yeah. Well, I mean, she actually texted me, which was really fun. I almost deleted the text, which obviously would have changed the trajectory of my career. But I mean, her and her husband, Terry, who own the Bills and the Sabres, are wonderful people. And I was deeply honored to work with them. And so that was first and foremost. But then second, when we started working on the new stadium there, I mean, there was conversations about what to do there and so forth, and they're still ongoing. So I'll be respectful of that. But the Toronto piece was really interesting because, obviously growing up in Buffalo, growing up in Toronto, being a Bills fan, I knew there was a connection there. And they're only, for those of you that don't know, it's only about a couple hour drive from Toronto to Buffalo, depending on how the border is. And so for me, that was really intriguing because it was my childhood team and there was a connection. And so, during my time there, we did focus groups, we did surveys, we did a lot of cool things around engaging that market. We did a watch party at Real Sports, which is the bar next to the Scotiabank Arena that drew like 1,000 people. I had a great marketing team, guy named Jordan McCarran, who, was driving that and doing a lot of game watches. And we did a lot of stuff with the community. So we did flag football events across the border. We wanted to put people in our logo and do events around that. So, we knew there was a vibrant fan base there, and we were studying the data and actually figuring out, okay, where to focus on different events and so forth. And I think, that's what they're doing now up there, which is awesome.
And, one of the questions, people after students who listen to the podcast are like, I want to work in sports. There's clearly substantial differences between working in sports and different leagues and different teams, other than obviously Buffalo and Cleveland literally being different sports. What are some of the different challenges that, the NFL team would look at versus an MLB team that are maybe not obvious or, something you didn't think about as much before you joined an NFL team?
Yeah. And I got exposure to the NHL too with the Sabres.
That's true, NHL team.
So I think I'll say hockey and baseball, especially baseball, obviously we have so many more events, so many games, so much more inventory. So the challenges are really, how do you monetize that? How do you maximize, getting people in the doors, right, and so forth. It's hard to do that on a Tuesday night against XY team in April when it's cold, or in hockey, October, November when football is really huge. So I think those are unique challenges to those, you know, leagues. And I imagine the NBA is probably the same. I've never worked in it, but I can see how that would be very, very similar. Football, I think, I mean, it's number one, right, in North America, and especially here in the US. Most markets, I challenge you to find a market where the NFL team is not the number one team, other than maybe New York and LA and certainly Toronto. But I think for the most part, the NFL team is going to be number one. So obviously in Cleveland, the Browns are number one. Here in Kansas City, obviously we have the Chiefs, and in Buffalo, the Bills were there. And so there's a different challenges too. I mean, it's one or the other. It's just, there, at least for the Bills, we were thinking about brand development, ancillary revenue streams. I talked about the app and the marketing. And I looked at it as, okay, we have 70,000 people. And again, I came in during COVID, right? We had no fans. So we had 70,000 people that theoretically can go to the stadium, but you have an infinite possibility in the digital ecosystem. And that's why we pursued the app as hard as we did. Now it's a top 5 team engagement on the app, because then you can actually use that to create all kinds of sponsorship opportunities and activation and connections with fans that happen 365 days a year, not just one event. Again, in baseball, I mean, the biggest challenge for us is, right, you have so many games, you want to get people here, and the engagement on a regular basis is slightly different. We're taping this podcast on a Monday. The Bills just played the Patriots on a Sunday night football that draws, whatever, 25, 30 million people on NBC, right? Those audiences just simply don't exist in baseball or any of the other sports on a regular basis. And so, again, it's a little bit of a different part of the equation that you got to work on, right? One is a little bit of brand development. There's obviously this element of selling tickets, but still there's more attention to it. Whereas the other one, you got to really cultivate that fan base. You got to grow it, and you got to work through the analytics and the numbers and the data, because there's more of it. And then you got to come up with some meaningful insights to really go out and get the fans here.
And then, yeah, one of the things I did want to circle back to that you mentioned, both in your responses with the Bills and just generally in terms of your career background, is your international experience. Clearly, the domestic 4 leagues have made international growth and expansion a big part of the overall growth strategy of the leagues, generally, and the team specifically. How do you think your experience working in these different markets and traveling to these different markets, has that impacted you or impacted your thinking, or how do you think that could help, in the future development of either the teams you're working for or sports leagues more generally?
Yeah, I don't. That's part of my brain that I don't use that much. Again, going back to that, but it's interesting. I mean, there's a little corollaries, right? Like when I worked in Japan, obviously I was exposed to baseball. I actually played on a semi-pro team with Double Click. It was fun. You get to see that, and you get to see the passion the sports have. But again, there's opportunities that happen, right? So I know the Japanese market, World Cup's happening, there's opportunities there here in the US, right? For a lot of teams to leverage these international markets that are going to be coming in to the States to hopefully drive baseball sales. Like there's opportunities there to be able to do different things. I've had exposure when I was at the NFL. They had this HMA program where they're looking at international markets. And so that's where I drew from my experience in working with Mexico, Brazil, Japan, the Asian markets, Australia, and so forth. We didn't bid on that at the Bills because we had Toronto, and that's Canada, and that's international. But, I know I talked to a bunch of teams about their process of how to look at that, because it is hard, right? I mean, setting up shop internationally. I remember when we were setting up our Google entity in Mexico and Brazil way back when, it's hard. Like, I mean, you don't think about these things, right? You have to set up your bank account. You have to set up how you're routing the local currency. How do you do local language contracts? Like, how do you do terms and conditions in that? These are all really meaningful things that have to be in place, that are also costly, right? That before you go out and do revenue stuff, which is the sort of sexy stuff to work on, and getting media blitzes, things like that. So, that's how I think about it. We don't have as much opportunity here with the Royals on that yet, but hopefully down the road.
Yeah, and bringing it back domestically to the Royals, talking more about kind of what you're doing now on a day-to-day basis in detail. You mentioned, although one of the things also I want to bring it up is in the context of Major League Baseball, improve seemingly growth in attendance, growth in local viewership. There's a lot of positive tailwinds happening with Major League Baseball generally. One, are you feeling those tailwinds locally at Kansas City, and then two, yeah, more about what you do more on a day-to-day basis, particularly given now that you've wrapped up another season.
Yeah, I think, baseball's in a great spot. I mean, well, first of all, it's a great game, but I'm also clearly biased. But the pitch clock, the faster games, I think are really tying into where the world's going with this, and people's attention spans, whether we like it or not, are shorter and shorter. So the game and the quality of the game and the quality of the product, I think, is awesome, which is great. I think the opportunities now are, again, how do you get people in, and how do you get them captivated? How do you get them to come back? And
Yeah.
so my strategy analytics team, spends a lot of time thinking through these things. We're, going through data. We're looking at per game modeling for next year, thinking through, okay, how do we, optimize this place in terms of revenue as well as attendance, which are both important. And then how do you work through that from an operational perspective, right? How do we make our food and beverage and retail offerings better? So we've used data to inform ourselves that people in this market really like local stuff. So we introduced a barbecue concept here from Joe's Barbecue, and shout out to them. They're amazing. And we've taken on a stand in right field that was getting very little traffic. We replaced it with Joe's, and the traffic and the revenue, increased 5x on that area, and without cannibalizing anything in the ballpark. From our stadium ops perspective, we use data and analytics to look at, okay, we have an app called Raven that everybody in the ballpark, on a game day, there's might be 1,000 employees across police, parking, your attendants, ushers, etc. That if there's anything that happens, they're required, right, to actually go into our app and log it. And so now we have all this rich ecosystem of analytics that we now have to actually study and figure out and curate, but actually can understand patterns, right? How many games people are looking at wheelchairs? Is that third base? Is the first base side? Is the food quality and the lines better on first base versus third base? What's our queue management? Those are the things that I spend a lot of time on now, thinking through that to help drive the larger revenue, and as well as the ticket side as well.
Are there any surprising insights that you found in terms of, you mentioned some, whether it's Joe's Barbecue or local, are there any other insights that you found that have helped or moved the needle from a game day operations perspective, or in terms of come back?
So I'll bring it back to the NBA thing. Obviously I went to Darden, but I'm sure you guys learned this at Kellogg as well, right? You take your operations class and you take queue management, right? So simple thing, right? Well, a lot of stadiums typically have what's called belly up. You go up to a stand and you have 3 rows, 4 rows, depending on how many POS, and you stand there in line and you buy your food. That creates lines, right? Because at certain points during the day or during a game, you have longer lines that back into a concourse, which creates more congestion, which hurts our fan experience. Well, going back to my operations classes, I learned that snake lines actually work. So if you have a snake line and you have one sort of point that leads to 4 different points of sale, that can be a potentially, again, I say potentially, more effective way of doing things. And that's what we've done. And that alleviated congestion in our concourses. It helped the line queues, and it created a better experience for our fans. So we're looking at that now. The next evolution is actually really use technology. So we've got this queue technology for next year where it has some cameras and it's tracking infrared movement and things like this. It's a lot more sophisticated, that actually can see like the movement patterns. So now we actually can be sure that the snake lines work better than the belly up, and actually put numbers against it. And we're doing that in our retail stand. So I could see in our retail location, we haven't launched it fully yet, but I could see how many people were going to be coming into the store and what percentage of those were actually going to the register. And that helps us make better decisions, right? And how we staff, how do we optimize the experience? How do we get people in and out quicker?
Yeah, and as we're getting towards the end of the episode, we wanted to ask our last question, which we also ask all of our guests, which is, you're in a management position, you're looking to hire folks, you've hired folks in the past. What are the types of skill sets, backgrounds, particularly for those, looking to get into sports or move through their career in sports or move up the career ladder in sports? What are some of the skills, backgrounds, experiences that you're looking for in candidates that you're looking to hire?
Yeah. I mean, the pool of candidates that I see on a regular basis wanting to come into sports, is way smarter than me. So it's pretty remarkable to see the evolution. But I think there's 3 things that I think will help any candidate, right? One is thought leadership, providing, some unique thought around things respectfully, right? But putting it in a manner of, hey, I think you could do it this way, etc., and pushing yourself that way. So that sort of second part of that equation is intellectual curiosity, right? Like just wanting to learn more and ask questions and get exposed to new things. And third. And then the third is I think something I really learned in sports and have carried it, and I think I'm getting better at it, hopefully, is just the empathetic leadership and being a leader that understands sort of how everybody's operating and how the different people and the different skill sets that you're going to have to be exposed to. I certainly don't know everything in this industry. So, you have to learn how to present things better too, because as an MBA, sometimes you get castigated as this or that. But at the end of the day, if you can show people that you're there to help them and have that empathetic leadership and that servant leadership, you can be very, very successful. And I think that's a more important trait than ever, and something that's really, really important in sports. Something candidly that I've had to learn as well, being in the industry now 9 years.
Yeah, a good place to end it. Good lesson for everybody who's listening to the podcast. So Jason, thank you for your time. Thank you for being a guest. And we appreciate all the insights you gave to our audience.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Adam.